Oh, good question. Yes, we did. So at the EIU, we had been expecting Democrats to hold on to the Senate. So that's the upper house, and one that has considerable powers in terms of approving appointments and other key jobs that will be very valuable to the Biden administration in the next 2 years. And the reason that we thought Democrats had a hope of holding on to the Senate was the fact that we saw this resurgence in voter engagement, again, which is not normal for a midterm election, over the course of this summer, and particularly in the wake of the Roe v. Wade overturning by the Supreme Court. And we thought that would probably show up in terms of voter engagement on the day and give a boost to Democrats. And it turns out that it did.
Mm-hmm. Now, while the Democrats appear to have held on to the Senate, do you see any scenario where they retain the House as well?
There have been some interesting election analyses that show a very narrow path for Democrats to hold on to just enough seats, but we think kind of on balance, it's not likely. And even that would be a pretty extreme outcome for Democrats because, as we noted earlier, it is very typical for control of the lower house to swing back for one party or another at the first midterms. So with history working against Democrats and a few races now left uncalled, it seems very unlikely that would happen.
Now, the economy consistently rated as the most important voting issue in these midterms. What does this result mean for the US economy as well as the global economy?
Well, I think, at least for the Biden administration in the near term, the fact that they weren't chucked out of Congress kind of writ large because of the way the economy is looking now, which I would say is a very shaky outlook. We think we'll see a mild recession in the US that starts toward the end of this year. That is a good outcome. It means that there are other issues at play, even if it always does kind of rank first, economy, inflation, in terms of how voters behave. We have to remember, for 2024, the next election, there are another 2 years to run, and we forecast a mild recession in the US, a recession in Europe, in particular with the energy crunch, and we'll see more of a year-on-year decline there, whereas for the US, it will be slightly softer. We think that near-term pain will be largely concentrated in 2023, with a bit of an economic rebound in 2024. So Democrats will be hoping by the time that voters go to the polls again, things will be looking slightly rosier on the inflation picture.
Abortion rights appeared to be the other major factor here as well. Many states passed measures to ensure access on a state level. Do you see the new Senate and the House of Reps in Washington taking any notice of those results?
I think it will definitely be very noticed. It will be certainly on the agenda, and we'll see Democrats, particularly in the Senate, trying to push that to find a way to codify it into US law, given that we have now the case precedent set by the Supreme Court. But with a divided Congress, again, assuming that Democrats control the Senate and Republicans the House, I would be very hesitant to think that we'd see any sort of lasting change. We'd likely see a lot of executive action by the Biden administration in the next 2 years because there's very little scope for bipartisan legislative kind of participation in the next couple of years, especially ahead of a very high stakes election. So Biden will be looking to do everything he can via executive action, but we have to remember those sort of things are both likely to be challenged in the courts with kind of a high level of polarization between the two parties and are vulnerable to being overturned in the next presidential administration if it does switch parties. So the administration is a bit hobbled. Congress is divided and will struggle to get anything major done. So abortion, I would put in that category of a big question mark.
Let's keep the focus on Joe Biden for now. Earlier this year, his approval ratings were at lows not seen since the Second World War. How did he still manage to stave off that red wave so many of us had been expecting?
Well, this was the bit that was so unique to this election. And I think it's a variety of things. Two that I would really point to are just how polarized the US electorate is. So we do see kind of a lot of noise, a lot of effort, a lot of money spent on elections. But by and large, this midterm and the last national elections that we've seen show a country that's pretty much divided 50-50. And that means that voter engagement is key, but also a variety of issues that really come to play. And with the abortion ruling this summer and concerns about some other civil rights that might come under review in the next couple of years that really help to engage the Democratic voter base, I think we're looking at a scenario where we have a finely divided country and lots of issues, economic, social, or political, that could drive voters to the polls. And it's not really one factor or another. Now, it wasn't an overwhelming outturn for Democrats, and his approval rating is still relatively low. That's probably not going to change. He has a big question of whether or not to run for election in 2024. Again, if we have this incredibly divided country, will he be the one who's able to mobilize Democrats? That's still undecided.
See, just on that, various polls have suggested voters don't want to see Joe Biden run for a second term. Does that matter anymore now that seeing that he's actually performed better than expected?
It matters less than it would have if the Democrats had a bad outturn, but it still matters. We'll have a little bit of a reprieve, I think, because Democrats did better than they were expected to do, and they now have a little bit less pressure on them from what they would have experienced under a Republican-controlled Congress. That gives them a bit of breathing room in the next year. But for better or for worse, in the US, election cycles basically start as soon as the last polls are closed. And so we're going to be thinking about 2024 already. And there will be a lot of pressure on Biden to consider his moves moving forward to set Democrats up to be as successful as possible. And again, the elections are 2 years away from now, and a lot can happen between now and then.
Well, let's shift focus to the other side now. The midterms have been called a referendum on a second Trump presidency. Based on these results, would a second tilt at the White House work for him?
He'll definitely try it. I think there's no question that he's not going to step back from the political scene, certainly not without creating some waves. But if anything, the midterms, again, showed that Trump's sway over Republican voters and his choice of candidates, perhaps most importantly, were just not as good as expected, not as good as hoped by much of the Republican base. So I think he's opened up a wide vulnerability to other Republican candidates. And I think Ron DeSantis, as we've all seen, is particularly well placed to stand up and potentially become the presumptive nominee. Now, Trump is still very popular with voters and with a strong kind of section of the House of Representatives in particular, and Congress more broadly. So we'd be moving too fast to write him off now, but certainly we'll see a very tight contest in the next couple of years as we head towards the election. And what that means, we think, is that effectively Republicans will struggle to work with a single voice in Congress, and that is going to be a real issue for them in an already quite divided Congress with extremely narrow majorities.
He is due to make what he called a big announcement tomorrow. Many speculated it's to announce his campaign for the top job. Would he be having second thoughts right now, or has he backed himself into a corner? Where do you see things going?
He's very clearly suggested he was going to announce his candidacy. I think it would be difficult to tee up that kind of public event and then not deliver the thing that people were expecting. To not do that would almost be an even greater sign of weakness to back off of his presidential run. So I think probably what we'll see is an announcement that he's running for the nomination and an effort to gloss over the kind of failures that we saw in some midterm races, focus on the bits that were successful and start to put his, again, presumptive opponents like DeSantis a little bit on guard. So I think this will be Trump coming out on the offensive, as we've seen him do so many times.
A very long 2 years ahead. Cailin Birch, thank you very much.
Thank you.